The early morning sun spilled gold across the tarmac at JFK, casting long shadows over the massive Boeing 777 preparing for departure. Flight 742, bound for London Heathrow, gleamed like a silver bullet against the awakening city. Ground crews moved with practiced precision, their footsteps echoing faintly on the concrete. Inside the terminal, passengers hurried to their gates, rolling suitcases and muttering travel plans, unaware that what was about to unfold at 35,000 feet would defy belief. Amelia Hartley lingered by the gate, her backpack slung over one shoulder, a travel nurse heading home after a grueling week of overtime. She sipped her lukewarm coffee, watching the line of travelers and employees with a quiet, habitual attentiveness. Something about the way people behaved, the anxious tapping, the hurried conversations, always fascinated her. She was calm, methodical, a woman accustomed to chaos in hospital trauma bays, yet unfamiliar with the subtle tension building among strangers in airports. Boarding began. Amelia joined the stream of passengers, passing the flight attendants who smiled politely but looked tired from early schedules. She stepped onto the jetway and felt the familiar hum of anticipation as she entered the cabin. Rows of plush seats stretched ahead, already filling with people hunched over phones, laptops, magazines, or staring out the window at the sun-drenched runway. Some carried nervous energy, others sheer exhaustion. Amelia slipped into 14C by the window and glanced around. The aisle was dotted with faces reflecting every imaginable emotion: excitement, fatigue, distraction, impatience. Captain Reynolds and First Officer Chen exchanged the usual pre-flight greetings in the cockpit, casual conversation masking the gravity of responsibility they carried. The hum of the engine started under their control, the vibration through the cabin like a heartbeat sinking everyone inside. Amelia watched from her window as the jetway retracted and the massive aircraft rolled onto the runway. The engines roared and the plane surged forward, a steel leviathan breaking free from the tethers of the city. The climb out of New York was smooth, bathed in the pink and gold glow of early dawn. Passengers adjusted their seats and blankets, some dozing, others scrolling through social media feeds, oblivious to the unseen tension in the air. Amelia flipped through a magazine absent-mindedly but kept her senses alert. She noticed small details others ignored: the way the flight attendants moved silently down the aisle, the subtle stiffness in the captain's posture during takeoff, the rhythmic vibrations of the engines. A nurse's intuition tells her to observe, to anticipate, to prepare. Hours passed, the autopilot engaged and the plane settled into its steady cruise over the Atlantic. Amelia had fallen into a meditative half-awareness, staring at the endless ocean below. From above, the Atlantic stretched like a dark mirror, waves glinting faintly as sunlight danced across the water. It was beautiful, infinite, indifferent. Around her, life inside the cabin settled into predictable patterns: soft conversations, the hum of engine, the occasional clink of beverage carts. Flight attendants moved methodically, ensuring passengers' comfort. The atmosphere was deceptively peaceful. Then it happened. A strange, sudden silence. Amelia's ears picked up the absence of the usual cockpit chatter. No routine announcements, no updates about altitude or flight path. The intercom crackled once, then went dead. A flight attendant furrowed her brow and pressed the handset again, calling for the cockpit. The static was unnerving, the absence of sound heavier than the roar of the engines themselves. Panic didn't erupt immediately. It started as subtle unease, a ripple beneath the calm surface. Amelia's attention sharpened. Her fingers clutched her magazine as she scanned the cabin, noticing the first signs of concern in the passengers' eyes. A man across the aisle muttered, "Is that normal?" No one answered. The young woman next to him held her child close, instinctively shielding the boy from the creeping tension. Flight attendants whispered to one another, sharing worried glances. Amelia could feel it in her chest, the prickling prelude to chaos. She had been in emergencies before, in corridors thick with blood, adrenaline, and fear, but nothing had prepared her for the helpless uncertainty of thousands of feet above the ocean with no guidance. Her mind raced. What could have caused the silence? Technical malfunction, pilot error, medical emergency in the cockpit. A part of her wanted to look away to sink into the illusion of safety, but another, louder part demanded action. She had trained for moments of pressure, though never like this. She leaned forward, peering into the small cockpit window, her eyes straining to see anything. No movement, no light, only the humming of instruments and the faint shadows of the captain's seat. The tension spread, almost tangible, through the cabin. A sudden cough, sharp and nervous, broke the silence from the back. Phones were lifted, flashes of worried faces reflected on screens. Amelia felt a surge of responsibility she hadn't expected. She wasn't a pilot. She wasn't in command. And yet the instinct to act, to stabilize, to protect, surged like a living thing inside her. She stood, voice firm though slightly trembling. "Everyone, stay calm. Sit down and buckle up." Eyes turned toward her, wide and searching. Some whispered thanks, others seemed shocked, as though the realization had dawned that someone had to take charge. Flight attendants nodded, grateful for her composure but tense, their training telling them this was no ordinary emergency. Amelia took a deep breath, heart hammering, and stepped closer to the cockpit door. Her fingers found the latch. A gentle twist, a cautious push, and the door surprisingly opened. Inside, the seats were empty except for the captain, slumped forward, motionless, head against the console. The first officer sat rigidly, eyes closed, the silence deafening. Amelia's stomach dropped, fear coiling tightly around her chest. This was no drill. This was reality. Her mind flashed through everything she knew about emergencies. Trauma, CPR, airway management, but flying a plane. She had no experience, no flight hours, no certification, nothing. Yet, as she glanced back at the rows of passengers staring at her in frozen panic, a decision formed. She would do whatever she could to get them home alive. Her hands hovered over the controls, trembling. The autopilot blinked almost in silent defiance, lights warning of minor deviations. Every dial and gauge was foreign. She could feel the engine's vibrations through her fingertips, feel the weight of thousands of lives pressing down with every heartbeat. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "You can do this. You have to." The hum of the engine seemed to grow louder, echoing through the cabin, through her chest, through every frozen moment of anticipation. Passengers shifted, murmuring nervously, gripping armrests, whispering prayers or clinging to loved ones. Amelia's breath came in shallow bursts as she reached for the radio microphone. Her voice, low but commanding, cut through the silence. I'm landing this plane." The words hung in the cabin like thunder. A beat of silence followed, heavy and impossible. Eyes widened. Passengers froze, some sinking further into their seats, some gripping each other with desperate strength. Flight attendants looked at her in awe and disbelief. The enormity of the declaration, the raw courage, the sheer impossibility, settled over everyone like a sudden storm cloud. Then for a moment nothing happened. The engines hummed. The ocean stretched below. And Amelia Hartley, ordinary nurse, found herself at the center of an extraordinary moment. She had no idea if she could actually do it, but she knew she had to try. And somewhere in the dark expanse of the Atlantic, above an indifferent sea, the first pulse of real panic began to spread. The calm had shattered. The flight had crossed the threshold from routine to nightmare. And as Amelia's fingers rested on the controls, a single thought crystallized in her mind. There was no turning back now. The cabin air suddenly felt heavier, thick with unease. Amelia's declaration lingered like a challenge that none of the passengers were ready to face. "I'm landing this plane." She could see disbelief etched into every face. The young mother clutching her child, the elderly man gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles had turned white, the business traveler frozen mid-bite into a sandwich. Eyes darted toward the cockpit, searching for reassurance. None came. The reality had hit. The pilots were incapacitated, and the responsibility of survival now rested on a stranger. Flight attendants exchanged glances, hesitation clear in their faces. One whispered almost to herself, "God help us." Amelia's nurse instincts kicked in. She had faced fear before: trauma rooms, cardiac arrests, shattered bones, but the magnitude of this was different. She was untrained for aviation, yet she could not allow panic to spread like wildfire. Taking a deep breath, she forced her voice to be steady, though it trembled inside. "Sit down. Buckle up. Stay calm. I will get us through this," she said, projecting authority. Her words cut through murmurs like a blade, but only slightly. A ripple of panic was inevitable. Murmurs became whispers, whispers became questioning shouts. The cabin temperature seemed to drop as fear settled in like a physical presence. A man in the middle section stood up abruptly, shouting, "What's happening? Why isn't the pilot?" Amelia stepped forward, placing a hand on the man's arm. "Please sit. Now, I need your cooperation. Everyone will be okay if we stay calm." Her words were desperate, but her gaze held an unexpected steel, the kind of unyielding clarity that could command attention even in chaos. Meanwhile, she leaned toward the cockpit door, glancing inside again. Captain Reynolds slumped forward, unconscious, his breathing irregular. First Officer Chen was similarly inert, one hand dangling over the console. Amelia's mind raced through the possibilities: medical emergency, stroke, heart attack. She had never seen anything like this at altitude. Her hands hovered over the control panel. The cockpit was a labyrinth of unknown buttons, dials, and alarms, everything she did not understand. Yet instinct pushed her forward. The plane was a living machine, waiting for someone to command it, and that someone had to be her. She gripped the radio microphone again, her voice firm, echoing into the cabin and the static of the aircraft systems. "Flight 742 to ground control. We have an emergency, pilots incapacitated, requesting guidance." Static answered her. A small, frightening static that seemed to swallow hope. She tried again. "Mayday, Mayday, Flight 742, Atlantic Ocean. Require immediate assistance. Anyone please respond." Passengers noticed the strain in her voice. Some sank lower into their seats, others clutched each other's hands. The young mother whispered, "Is she really going to land this plane?" Her own fear reflected in the child's wide, innocent eyes. Amelia caught the gaze and forced a smile, a tiny act of courage that belied the storm inside her. A flight attendant approached, voice shaking but professional. "Do you want me to assist with the passengers?" Amelia nodded quickly. "Yes. Calm them, keep them seated, explain we are being guided. Do not panic, please now." The attendant nodded, walking down the aisle, repeating Amelia's instructions with a quiver in her voice. Amelia returned to the cockpit, hands brushing across buttons she didn't understand. The yoke felt heavy, unnatural in her grasp. The screens blinked, warning lights flashed red, and an alarm shrieked somewhere in the maze of panels. She jumped slightly, heart hammering. Her mind raced through fragmented memories of simulations she'd seen on TV, basic principles of flight she'd read once in a magazine, the way autopilot worked. Could she really do this? There was no one to tell her she could not. She had to try. The plane shuddered as it hit a small pocket of turbulence. Amelia's stomach sank, adrenaline spiking. She gripped the controls tighter, trying to maintain steady pressure, trying to coax the plane into obedience. Every vibration, every alarm, every subtle shudder demanded instantaneous decision-making. One wrong choice, and the Atlantic would swallow them whole. She could feel the weight of hundreds of lives pressing down on her chest like the ocean itself. Passengers were beginning to murmur, fear climbing, curiosity mixed with dread. A man whispered to his wife, "Is she really flying it?" Amelia caught snippets of conversation as she passed back through the aisle to check on passengers. "Is she trained? She's a nurse." "Oh God, oh God, oh God." Every eye followed her movements, a mix of terror and hope. Her breath caught in her throat. If she wavered, they would falter. She could not allow that. She returned to the cockpit. The instruments were overwhelming. Altitude, airspeed, heading, flaps, autopilot, dials she could not decipher. She remembered snippets from a magazine article about planes and autopilot systems. With a shaking hand, she nudged the yoke slightly, trying to maintain balance. The plane responded imperfectly but cooperatively. Amelia's pulse raced. This was no longer theory. It was life and death. Then came the next shock. The intercom crackled, a faint voice breaking through static. Flight 742, this is London ATC. We read you confirm status. Relief hit her like a tidal wave. I'm taking control. The pilots are incapacitated. We need guidance. Can you talk me through landing? She felt her throat tight. Her voice sounded small, tentative, but carried across thousands of feet of air and ocean. The voice returned, calm, professional, authoritative. Flight 742, maintain heading. Do not panic, adjust flaps gradually. We'll guide you through every step. You can do this. Amelia clutched the yoke, her hands slick with sweat, fear coiling tight inside her. The reassurance was fragile but enough to anchor her. Yet terror remained, unyielding and constant. One misstep could be catastrophic. Below her, passengers shifted anxiously. Some whispered prayers, others held children tighter. Amelia noticed a man in the aisle shaking silently, tears rolling down his cheeks. She wanted to tell him it will be okay, but she didn't know if it would be. All she could do was take another deep breath, repeat the instructions in her mind, and force her shaking hands to obey the controls. Turbulence struck harder now, tossing the plane like a toy. Amelia swore under her breath. The autopilot blinked warnings, alarms screamed, and the plane groaned under the strain. She tightened her grip, leaning over the controls, whispering to herself, "You can do this. You can do this. You have to." She was no longer a passenger, no longer just a nurse. She was the captain now, the anchor for every terrified soul aboard. As she worked, a sudden jolt threw her forward slightly. The plane lurched violently, passengers screamed. A tray table toppled, clattering to the floor. Amelia's stomach lurched in sympathy with the aircraft. She gritted her teeth. "Stay seated. Brace yourselves." Her voice rang over the intercom, commanding attention but trembled with fear. And then a new sound cut through the chaos. Faint yet unmistakable, a faint voice over the radio breaking the static again, guiding her. Step by step, instruction by instruction, someone was leading her through the impossible, relief mixed with terror. Every word had the potential to save or doom them. Amelia repeated each command, trembling, struggling to interpret what she barely understood. Every second felt like minutes, every breath a battle. The plane steadied slightly, responding to her adjustments. Eyes in the cabin widened as passengers sensed the shift. Perhaps survival was possible. Perhaps, against all odds, someone ordinary could perform extraordinary courage. But Amelia knew this was only the beginning. The Atlantic stretched below, indifferent and endless. The pilots were still unconscious. And the runway, a distant lifeline thousands of miles away, was still far beyond reach. Her heart raced, sweat stung her eyes, fingers white on the yoke. And yet somewhere deep inside, a fragile resolve formed. "I can do this. I have to do this." She glanced back at the passengers, their wide eyes reflecting fear and hope. Her next step would decide everything. And as the plane continued over the dark, unforgiving ocean, one terrifying truth crystallized in her mind. This was no longer a drill, no simulation, no rehearsal. This was real. Lives depended on her. And she had no choice but to act. The cabin fell into tense silence. Not the calm of routine flight, but the heavy silence of collective dread. Everyone waited for the next move. Amelia inhaled, tightening her grip, whispering under her breath, "We're going to make it." Then the plane shuddered again, harder this time, an ominous warning from the Atlantic itself. The cockpit was a labyrinth of blinking lights, levers, and dials, each one a warning or an instruction Amelia had no formal training to understand. Sweat dripped from her forehead, stinging her eyes, but she didn't dare wipe it away. Every second counted. The plane hummed and vibrated beneath her, a living, breathing beast stretching over the vast Atlantic. She felt the weight of hundreds of souls pressing down, their collective fear coiling around her chest. This was more than responsibility. This was survival. Amelia gripped the yoke tighter. She had no formal flight experience, no flight simulator hours, not even a cursory lesson in aviation. But she had instincts honed from years of trauma care. Acute observation, rapid decision-making, calm under pressure. She could read subtle cues, assess danger, anticipate outcomes. Every vibration in the cabin, every flicker of a warning light, Every passenger reaction became data in her mind. She adjusted her posture, leaned closer to the instruments, and began to memorize the plane's responses. The radio crackled again. Flight 742 maintain heading, flaps at 15 degrees, airspeed stable, altitude steady, we are monitoring you, do not panic. The voice was calm, almost soothing, a tether in the chaos. Amelia nodded, repeating each instruction aloud to herself before attempting it on the controls. The flaps, unfamiliar and stiff, moved incrementally. The plane shuddered but obeyed. It was imperfect obedience, but it was enough. Below, passengers were murmuring. Some whispered prayers, others were frozen in disbelief. Flight attendants clung to their training, calming passengers as best they could. Amelia caught sight of the young mother clutching her son tightly. The child looked up at her, eyes wide and uncomprehending. Amelia forced a smile, the tiniest flicker of reassurance. We're going to get through this. Somehow. The plane jerked violently as turbulence hit like a wall. Amelia's stomach dropped. The autopilot alarm screamed, warning of minor deviations she barely understood. She felt panic clawing at her, a primal instinct urging flight from the cockpit. She swallowed hard, forcing her hands to obey, forcing her mind to focus. This was no longer optional. She could not hesitate. 1 second of indecision could cost hundreds of lives. She glanced around the cockpit. The seats where the pilots had been slumped empty, but her eyes fell on the faint red glow of instruments that suddenly made sense in a fragmented way. She had read about these dials vaguely in a magazine years ago. Some memory flickered: altimeter, vertical speed indicator, throttle control. She mimicked what she remembered, adjusting slowly, carefully, testing, watching for responses. The plane responded ever so slightly. Progress. A sudden alarm blared, a red warning light flashing aggressively. Her heart raced. Engine, systems, altitude. Panic threatened to overtake her, but she inhaled, slow and deliberate. Her hands shook violently on the yoke as she reached for the knob labeled autopilot. Fingers pressed, twisted, retried. Finally, a hum indicated it had engaged partially. The plane stabilized, though still precariously. Amelia exhaled, the first fragile relief she'd felt since takeoff. She returned to the radio. Flight 742, autopilot partially engaged, plane stabilizing, what's next? The controller's voice crackled, calm but urgent. Good, maintain heading. Reduce altitude gradually, begin descent slowly, watch speed. Amelia repeated the instructions aloud, turning them into a mantra: maintain heading. Reduce altitude, begin descent, watch speed. She adjusted the throttles, nudged the yoke, flaps inching down incrementally. The plane responded, a tentative obedience, like a horse trusting a rider's hand for the first time. Turbulence struck again, harder this time. Amelia braced herself. The cabin jolted violently, passengers screaming. Tray tables slammed down, luggage shifted, panic threatening to spread. Amelia's hands white on the controls, eyes locked on the horizon, repeating instructions. Keep calm, focus. 1 step at a time. She caught sight of a young man clutching a laptop bag as if it were a lifeline. His wide eyes met hers, and for a moment she drew courage from their shared terror. Her voice was steady on the intercom, despite the quiver in her chest. Everyone, stay seated. Brace for bumps. We're following instructions. Do not panic. She knew words alone were not enough, but it was all she had. Some passengers whispered prayers, others clung silently to each other. One elderly woman murmured, God help us all. Amelia held her breath, feeling the weight of every life aboard. Minutes stretched like hours. The Atlantic below seemed endless, dark, and unforgiving. Every decision Amelia made was a leap into the unknown. Her fingers moved faster, instincts guiding her in ways she could not explain. She was no pilot, but she was determined. We will survive. I will make sure we survive. Then came the first breakthrough. The plane leveled slightly, responding to her subtle adjustments. Flaps set correctly, speed moderated, altitude holding. Amelia's pulse raced, a heady mix of adrenaline and fragile hope. Yes, yes, she whispered under her breath, as if speaking the thought aloud could solidify reality. She turned back toward the passengers, catching a fleeting glance of their expressions, fear mingled with awe, panic with a spark of belief. Her eyes returned to the instruments. Another warning light flared. A low hum indicated some system issue. She had no idea what it meant, but instinct told her to stabilize the yoke, check the throttles, monitor airspeed. Her heart pounded in synchrony with the engines, each beat reminding her of the stakes. The plane was responsive barely, but it was alive, obedient under her hands. She had become the unlikely pilot, the voice of authority in a world suspended above the Atlantic. The radio crackled again. Flight 742, excellent work. You're responding well. Keep adjustments gradual. Do not overcorrect. Amelia nodded, repeating each word aloud as she made tiny corrections, flaps inching, throttle nudged, heading maintained. The plane tilted slightly, then leveled again. Victory felt fragile, ephemeral, but it was enough to keep her going. Suddenly the plane shuddered violently. The overhead bins rattled. Passengers screamed. The engines groaned. Amelia's stomach lurched as the plane dipped slightly, then righted itself. She bit her lip, whispering a mantra. Steady, steady, steady. Her mind raced with calculations she didn't consciously know she was making, instincts taking over where knowledge failed. She could do this. She had to. Somewhere in the back of the plane, a child whimpered. Amelia caught her reflection in the cockpit glass, pale, sweat-streaked, determined beyond reason. She swallowed fear, gripping the yoke tighter. Her voice, firm and clear, broke through the cabin again. Stay calm, follow instructions. We are safe if we do exactly as I say. Passengers nodded, whispering, clutching each other. Hope was a fragile thread, but it existed. Amelia's gaze returned to the horizon. She could see the Atlantic stretching endlessly, the sun beginning to dip toward the edge of the water. The plane was responding ever so slightly to her commands. For the first time, she allowed herself a sliver of confidence. She was no pilot, but she was learning, improvising, surviving. And for the first time, she believed they might make it. And then a sudden, violent jolt shook the aircraft. Warning lights blared. The autopilot disengaged. Turbulence struck with unrelenting force. Passengers screamed, some clinging to seats, some crying aloud. Amelia's knuckles whitened on the yoke. She leaned forward, eyes wide, adrenaline surging. Every instinct screamed to panic, yet she could not. She had to guide the plane, keep it alive, keep everyone alive. Amelia took a deep breath, whispering almost to herself, I have this. I'm landing this plane. The words echoed in her mind, a fragile anchor in the storm. She adjusted the flaps, nudged the throttle, and whispered again, this time aloud into the radio. Guide me, I'm ready. Tell me what to do next. And then, just as the plane lurched violently again, a glimmer appeared on the horizon, faint but undeniable. Tiny, distant, like a lifeline across the dark Atlantic waters. The faint lights of a runway, hundreds of miles away, the only thread between survival and disaster. Amelia's breath caught. Every passenger's eyes were on her now, wide, waiting, hopping. The impossible was no longer theoretical. She would have to cross that expanse, above the indifferent ocean, against turbulence and fear, toward a distant, fragile promise of life. And with the lights twinkling in the horizon, the enormity of the next challenge hit her. She would have to land the plane herself. The Atlantic stretched below like an endless void, indifferent and unforgiving. Amelia's hands trembled on the yoke, sweat streaking her pale face, but she forced herself to focus. The plane hummed under her fingers, alive and unpredictable, every vibration a warning, every shudder a reminder of the stakes. The cockpit was a maze of glowing buttons, switches, and blinking lights she did not fully understand. She had no training, no backup, and no margin for error. Yet she was the captain now, the only person keeping hundreds of lives tethered to survival. The faint glimmer of the runway had grown imperceptibly brighter, a fragile promise in the horizon, but it was still hundreds of miles away. Amelia repeated the instructions from London ATC, trying to commit every word to memory while simultaneously adjusting throttle, flaps, and rudder with hands that shook violently. The plane shuddered with turbulence, tilting side to side, and Amelia braced herself, biting back a gasp. Her pulse pounded in her ears, the hum of the engines syncing with her heartbeat. Passengers were growing restless. Murmurs filled the cabin, some whispers of hope, some trembling with fear. Flight attendants worked to calm the chaos, their own terror lurking behind practiced smiles. Amelia glanced at the young mother clutching her child. The boy's eyes were wide, uncomprehending, reflecting raw panic and a fragile trust. The mother's grip tightened, silently pleading for a miracle. Amelia forced herself to smile, a fleeting gesture of reassurance she barely felt herself. "We're going to make it, somehow," she thought, repeating the mantra to keep her mind from cracking. The radio crackled again. "Flight 742, adjust heading 2 degrees starboard. Maintain speed, keep flaps at current setting, watch descent rate." Amelia nodded, repeating the words aloud as she followed each instruction. Her hands were unsteady but precise. The plane responded, obedient in the tiniest increments. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe they could survive, and then turbulence hit harder, throwing the plane into a violent dip. Tray tables slammed, luggage shifted, and screams echoed through the cabin. Amelia's stomach lurched. She leaned into the yoke, holding on with every ounce of strength, whispering instructions to herself. "Keep steady, watch instruments, adjust gradually." She felt her knees trembling. The plane was alive beneath her, uncooperative, testing her at every turn. One wrong adjustment could trigger disaster. One miscalculated throttle, one missed cue, and the Atlantic would claim them. She swallowed hard, eyes darting between instruments and horizon, trying to make sense of the complex dance of gravity, lift, and momentum. Below, passengers whispered prayers. Some held hands tightly, some closed their eyes, some murmured quiet reassurances to children who did not understand. The cabin was thick with tension, fear hanging in the air like a physical weight. Amelia caught the gaze of an elderly man gripping his armrest, and their eyes locked. Hope and terror collided in that single moment. She nodded at him, and he nodded back, a silent pact of survival forming between stranger and stranger. Amelia's focus returned to the cockpit. The autopilot warnings blinked insistently, red lights screaming at her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, heart hammering. "Do I override? Adjust manually?" She chose instinct. Hands firm, she made minor adjustments to maintain level flight, nudging flaps, throttle, and rudder as if coaxing a wild horse into submission. The plane responded, imperfectly but obedient enough to continue. Minutes stretched into hours in perception, each second heavy with consequence. Amelia felt the weight of every life aboard pressing on her chest, a silent reminder that hesitation was lethal. She glanced at the passengers again, noticing subtle changes. Some whispered prayers more fervently, others stared silently, gripping each other in terror and trust. Flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, their professionalism masking fear. Amelia allowed herself a brief, fleeting glance at the young boy, whose small hand was pressed to his mother's arm. "We must survive," she thought fiercely. The radio crackled again, London ATC's voice steady, guiding her step by step. "Flight 742, slight descent. Reduce altitude gradually. Maintain airspeed. Begin approach preparations. You're doing well." Amelia repeated the instructions aloud, translating them into action. She adjusted throttles, nudged flaps, monitored airspeed. The plane dipped slightly, then leveled again. Relief surged through her, quickly replaced by the reality. Turbulence would not ease, and the ocean below remained indifferent, infinite. Then a sudden jolt rattled the aircraft, sharper than before. Amelia gritted her teeth, gripping the yoke with all her strength. The engines groaned as the plane pitched violently, tossing passengers in their seats. Panic erupted in muted screams. Tray tables rattled, luggage shifted. Amelia's mind raced, calculating every possible adjustment, weighing every action. 1 second of hesitation, one wrong move, and the Atlantic would swallow them. She adjusted the flaps gradually, nudged the throttle, whispered encouragement to herself. "You can do this. You must do this." Amelia's eyes caught the horizon again. The runway lights were slightly brighter, tiny beacons in the dark expanse, but still impossibly distant. Her chest tightened, fear and determination colliding. "We're getting there. Step by step." She repeated the mantra like a lifeline, hands steadying despite the tremor in her legs. The plane obeyed her commands in small increments, a fragile cooperation forged between human and machine. Passengers began to whisper in disbelief. Some noticed the plane leveling slightly. Others clutched each other with quiet hope, realizing survival was becoming a tangible possibility. Amelia could sense their attention, their hope, their fear, all feeding into her resolve. She could not fail. Not now, not ever. We will make it. We must. The turbulence intensified suddenly, more violent, more chaotic. Amelia's stomach dropped. The plane tilted sharply, then righted itself just enough to keep from veering completely off course. She pressed her lips together, clenching her jaw to suppress panic, adjusting flaps and throttles in rapid succession, guided by instinct and the distant voice of London ATC. The aircraft trembled, groaned, resisted, but Amelia refused to yield. Then came a moment of surreal clarity. The Atlantic below, endless and merciless, seemed to shrink in her perception. The runway lights ahead glimmered like a fragile promise. The plane, responding to her adjustments, maintained a tenuous stability. The passengers whispered, some praying, some holding their breath, all sensing the delicate balance of life and death hanging in the hands of an untrained stranger. Amelia inhaled deeply, gripping the yoke with every ounce of strength. She whispered to herself, "We're almost there, just a little farther, keep steady." She felt the plane respond to her micro-adjustments, tilting slightly to compensate for the turbulent air. The engines hummed, warning lights blinked. Alarms shrieked intermittently, but Amelia persisted, translating instinct into action, fear into precision. And then, just as hope began to glimmer faintly, the plane lurched violently again. A sudden gust of wind caught the wingtip, sending a shudder through the fuselage. Passengers screamed, children cried, and Amelia's hands whitened on the yoke. She leaned into the controls, heart pounding, whispering a mantra she had never known she could repeat. "I can do this. I am landing this plane. We will survive." The cockpit instruments blinked red, warning of minor system failures. Amelia ignored the panic threatening to rise inside her, focusing instead on the horizon, the runway lights, the instructions she had memorized. Step by step, adjustment by adjustment, the plane inched closer to stability. The Atlantic stretched below, endless and unforgiving, and yet Amelia felt, for the first time, a fragile connection between herself, the aircraft, and the lives suspended above the void. Her voice, calm but trembling, broke over the intercom once more. "Everyone, stay calm. We are being guided. I need you to trust me." Some passengers clutched each other tighter, others whispered prayers. The young mother's child pressed his face against her arm, wide-eyed. Amelia felt a surge of determination, a deep, visceral resolve. She would not fail, not now, not ever. Then the plane lurched again, violently this time, and the lights of the distant runway flickered in the horizon, a fragile, tantalizing promise. Amelia's pulse surged. Every passenger's gaze was on her, wide, desperate, trusting. The next steps would define life or death. And as she braced herself, adjusting flaps, throttle, and yoke with trembling precision, a terrifying realization hit her. The descent was only beginning. The Atlantic had been survived, but the runway awaited, and the true test was yet to come. The Atlantic below was a dark, endless expanse, indifferent to the lives suspended above it. Amelia's hands were white on the yoke, sweat stinging her eyes, and the cockpit felt alive with every vibration and shudder. She repeated London ATC's instructions aloud, each word a lifeline: maintain heading, reduce altitude gradually, begin approach, watch speed. The plane responded, a fragile obedience, its engines humming with a tension that mirrored her own heartbeat. Every adjustment was a test of instinct, patience, and courage. Failure was not an option. Lives depended entirely on her. Passengers in the cabin clutched their armrests, children pressed against parents, and murmurs of prayer filled the air. Flight attendants moved methodically down the aisles, offering reassurance where they could, their faces pale but determined. Amelia's voice echoed faintly over the intercom, calm but commanding. "Everyone, stay seated. Brace yourselves for turbulence. Follow instructions. We're being guided. We're safe if we act together." The words were a thread of hope, a tether holding together hundreds of fraying nerves. She leaned closer to the instrument, scanning the blinking lights and unfamiliar dials. Each one seemed to demand knowledge she did not have, every alarm a challenge she could barely comprehend. Yet instinct guided her. The subtle tilt of the aircraft, the gentle sway of the engine's hum, the micro vibrations through the yoke, they were data, and she processed it like a trauma nurse reading vital signs. Step by step, adjustment by adjustment, she coaxed the plane into compliance. The radio crackled. Flight 742, excellent, you're doing well. Reduce altitude gradually, begin approach preparation, maintain airspeed and heading. Amelia nodded, repeating the instructions aloud as she executed them. Flaps moved slowly, throttles adjusted, and the plane responded incrementally. A small victory, fragile but vital. She exhaled, barely allowing herself to feel it. There was no time for relief. The Atlantic was merciless, the distance to the runway unforgiving, and turbulence was growing stronger. The plane lurched violently. Turbulence tore through the aircraft, shaking it from wingtip to fuselage. Passengers screamed, some clutching each other, some gripping armrests so tightly knuckles turned white. Tray tables slammed down. A young man's laptop fell, clattering across the aisle. Amelia's stomach dropped in unison with the aircraft's dip. Her fingers moved automatically over the controls, nudging flaps, adjusting throttle, tilting the yoke. Her pulse raced, every second stretching into an eternity. Somewhere in the cabin, a child whimpered, eyes wide and innocent. Amelia's gaze caught the mother, who whispered, "We trust you." A fragile thread of connection, human and unspoken, strengthened her resolve. "We must survive. I cannot fail them." She leaned forward, pressing her lips together, repeating ATC instructions aloud. Reduce altitude, maintain heading, adjust gradually. Each word was a lifeline, a mantra, a step towards survival. The Atlantic below stretched endlessly, a dark mirror reflecting nothing but the plane and her courage. Every adjustment she made was calculated, tiny, precise. She could feel the aircraft responding, obedient in the smallest increments. Yet the turbulence continued to punish them, throwing the plane from side to side. Amelia's muscles ached from tension. Every fiber of her being was focused entirely on the survival of those inside the cabin. She swallowed fear, channeling it into precision. London ATC guided her through the descent, voice calm, measured, professional. Flight 742, reduce speed, adjust flaps to 25 degrees, altitude stable, approach course confirmed, you are responding well. Amelia repeated each step aloud, fingers moving over the controls with shaking precision. The plane dipped slightly, leveled, then dipped again. A surge of adrenaline shot through her chest. She had no pilot training, no formal experience, and yet she was guiding this massive aircraft across turbulent skies toward a distant runway. Passengers sensed the subtle stability emerging. Whispers of hope threaded through the cabin, quiet but palpable. The elderly man gripped his wife's hand, eyes fixed on Amelia in awe. The young mother's child pressed closer, sensing the fragile calm. Flight attendants moved like ghosts down the aisles, their fear tempered by professionalism, ensuring the cabin remained as stable as possible. Amelia's voice cut through again. "Stay calm. We are being guided. Follow instructions. We can survive this." And then turbulence struck with unprecedented force. The plane pitched violently, engines groaning under the stress. A sudden drop made several passengers gasp audibly. Amelia's stomach lurched, her hands gripping the yoke with desperate strength. "Brace yourselves," she shouted over the intercom. Tray tables rattled, luggage shifted, and a crash of fear erupted through the cabin. Amelia's knuckles whitened. This was beyond ordinary turbulence. The Atlantic seemed determined to test every ounce of courage she possessed. She leaned into the yoke, forcing the plane to respond. Step by step, minute adjustments kept the aircraft from veering completely off course. Her mind raced, calculating angles, throttle settings, and flap positions. Every second was a life-or-death calculation. She whispered to herself, "I can do this. I must do this." And slowly, miraculously, the plane began to stabilize. Flight 742, excellent, ATC's voice crackled. "You're responding. Begin final approach preparations. Maintain glide slope. Watch airspeed carefully. Keep calm, you can do this. Amelia repeated the instructions aloud, fingers moving with trembling precision. The plane dipped slightly, then leveled. For the first time since takeoff, she sensed real possibility. Survival was no longer a distant hope, it was within reach. But the Atlantic was still merciless. Gusts of wind struck unpredictably, shaking the plane, threatening to undo every inch of control she had fought to establish. Her heart raced. Her hands shook violently on the yoke, but she refused to yield. The lives of every passenger and crew member hung in the balance. She whispered, almost silently, "We're almost there. We must make it." Passengers, sensing the plane's tentative stability, began to whisper quietly among themselves. Some murmured prayers, others held each other, clinging to the fragile hope Amelia embodied. The young mother whispered to her child, "We're safe thanks to her." Amelia caught the exchange, her pulse surging, determination strengthening. She had to keep them alive, guide them through the remaining turbulence, and prepare for the ultimate challenge: landing. The lights of the distant runway grew imperceptibly brighter, tiny beacons in the darkness. Amelia's chest tightened with anticipation and fear. The plane responded to her subtle adjustments, inching closer to the course that would lead them to life. Step by step, flaps nudged, throttle adjusted, yoke tilted. Every movement was deliberate, precise, a ballet between human courage and machine compliance. Then, without warning, a violent gust struck the wingtip, sending a shudder through the fuselage. Passengers screamed. A tray table fell, luggage slid, and Amelia's knuckles whitened. She leaned into the controls, whispering to herself, "Keep steady, steady, steady." The plane obeyed barely, but it was enough. Survival was possible, but only if she could continue to manage every unpredictable twist of wind, every pulse of turbulence. Her eyes returned to the runway lights, faint but unwavering. Step by step, adjustment by adjustment, she guided the plane closer. The Atlantic below stretched endlessly, a dark void indifferent to the fragile thread of hope above. The cockpit instruments flashed warnings, the engines groaned, and turbulence battered the fuselage. But Amelia persisted. The impossible was within reach. And then the plane lurched violently again, the largest jolt yet. Passengers screamed, clinging to armrests, hearts hammering. Amelia's pulse surged, but she refused to falter. She leaned into the yoke, nudging flaps and throttle, repeating ATC's instructions like a lifeline. The plane stabilized enough to continue the approach. But as the runway lights grew closer, the enormity of the final descent struck her. She would have to land this plane herself. The cabin fell into tense silence, broken only by the hum of engines and the collective breath of hundreds of passengers. Amelia's hands tightened on the yoke, her jaw set with determination. The Atlantic had been survived. The first approach had begun. And now the impossible challenge loomed, guiding the aircraft to the tarmac, alive, intact, whole. The runway lights glimmered faintly on the distant horizon, tiny beacons of hope across the dark, endless Atlantic. Amelia Hartley's hands were white-knuckled on the yoke, sweat streaming down her face, vision narrowed with focus. She had stabilized the plane, navigated turbulence, and maintained the glide slope thanks to ATC's guidance, but the hardest part lay ahead. The descent. The final approach. Landing a Boeing 777 with no training. The thought alone made her chest tighten, but fear was luxury she could not afford. She inhaled deeply, forcing her heartbeat into a steady rhythm. Passengers whispered, some quietly praying, some holding loved ones, all sensing the tension that radiated from the cockpit. Flight attendants moved quickly, instructing people to brace, to lock seats upright, to fasten harnesses tightly. The atmosphere was thick with panic and anticipation. Amelia's voice came through the intercom, firm but tinged with controlled fear. "Everyone, stay calm. Keep seatbelts tight. We are beginning our descent. Trust me and follow instructions. We can make it." The words hung in the air, a fragile tether of reassurance. The plane tilted slightly as Amelia nudged the yoke to align with the glide slope. Turbulence tore at the fuselage, violent gusts rocking the aircraft. Her stomach lurched as the plane dipped, the Atlantic stretching below like a void eager to swallow them. Every instinct screamed panic, but her hands moved with calculated precision. Small adjustments to throttle, subtle nudges to flaps, tiny shifts in the yoke. She whispered over the radio, London ATC approaching, runway adjustments made. Maintaining glide slope. Flight 742, you're responding. Continue approach. Slight correction to the left, maintain descent rate. Watch airspeed carefully, came the calm voice of ATC. Amelia nodded, repeating the instructions aloud as she executed each one. The plane responded imperfectly, stubbornly, but obeyed. Every second was a battle between physics and courage, gravity and resolve. One miscalculation, one overcorrection, and the Atlantic would claim them all. In the cabin, the fear was palpable. A child whimpered softly, clutching a parent. The elderly man gripped his wife's hand, whispering prayers that mixed with the collective hum of suppressed panic. A flight attendant moved through the aisle, reassuring passengers, voice tight but professional, "Keep calm, we're being guided. The landing is possible. Stay seated." Amelia caught the murmured hope in their eyes, and it fueled her determination. She adjusted the throttles, keeping the airspeed steady. Flaps extended gradually, the plane shuddering as it responded. The wings flexed under turbulence, groaning like live creatures. Amelia's stomach churned as gusts hit, tilting the plane violently. Passengers screamed. The young mother clutched her child, whispering, "We're almost there, we'll be okay." Amelia's heart pounded. Her hands moved faster, but with precision honed by instinct, adrenaline, and desperation. She could not falter. A sudden jolt threw the plane off balance. The runway lights flickered, seemingly shifting with the turbulence. "Hold steady, steady, steady," Amelia whispered to herself. The plane dipped, then righted itself. Her pulse raced, every adjustment a small battle against forces she barely understood. The yoke vibrated in her hands. Instruments flashed warnings. She ignored them all except for the essential: altitude, airspeed, heading. Every other detail was secondary. Survival depended on focus. Flight 742, you are stable. Begin final descent adjustments. Glide slope aligned. Keep flaps at 30 degrees. Airspeed stable, came ATC's voice. Amelia repeated aloud, flaps 30 degrees, airspeed stable, glide slope aligned, and nudged the controls. The plane dipped closer to the Atlantic, engines humming under strain, wings flexing violently. Passengers screamed softly, some whispered prayers, others clutched each other in silent terror. Amelia's knuckles whitened as she guided the massive aircraft inch by inch, each second stretching into eternity. Suddenly, a violent gust struck the left wing. The plane lurched, dropping hundreds of feet in a heartbeat. Screams erupted in the cabin. Amelia's stomach flipped violently, bile rising, but she forced her hands to steady the yoke. Adjust throttle, stabilize flaps, keep glide slope. She repeated the mantra, translating fear into action. Slowly, painstakingly, she corrected the tilt, nudged the throttle, coaxed the plane back onto course. The engines groaned, wings flexed, but the aircraft responded. Survival was still within reach. The runway lights grew closer. A flicker of hope illuminated the cockpit. Amelia's pulse surged, but her mind was sharp, every adjustment precise. She adjusted the throttle to reduce speed incrementally, nudged the flaps further, and tilted the yoke subtly to counter the relentless gusts. The plane responded inch by inch, but turbulence was merciless. The Atlantic below remained an endless void, indifferent to courage or skill. Passengers braced themselves, eyes wide, hearts hammering. Some whispered, "She can do this, she's keeping us alive." Others closed their eyes, muttering prayers. The young mother whispered to her child, "We're going to make it, we're safe." Amelia caught their faces in fleeting glances as she maneuvered, a human anchor for hundreds of terrified souls. Her hands moved on instinct, adrenaline guiding precision, terror sharpening focus. Then the plane lurched violently again. Warning lights flashed, engines groaned, and a deafening jolt threw passengers forward. Amelia's stomach dropped. She whispered aloud, "Steady, steady, steady," fingers flying, hands white on the yoke, nudging flaps, adjusting throttle. She coaxed the plane back into alignment with the runway. The lights were closer, beckoning like fragile threads of survival across the darkness. ATC's voice came over the radio, calm but urgent. "Flight 742, you're aligned. Begin final descent. Maintain speed. Flaps extended. Keep calm. You are doing well." Amelia repeated aloud, final descent, flaps extended, speed maintained, keep calm. Step by step, inch by inch, she guided the plane closer to the runway. The Atlantic below roared silently, a reminder of the stakes, a vast abyss that would claim them with a single misstep. The plane dipped again, violently. Amelia's stomach lurched. She gritted her teeth, whispered prayers under her breath, and adjusted the yoke. Flaps shifted, throttle nudged, airspeed corrected. The plane obeyed, inching toward the runway. Passengers clutched each other tighter, eyes wide with terror and hope. Flight attendants moved silently, bracing themselves as the aircraft trembled under every gust. And then, as the runway lights approached, a new alarm shrieked in the cockpit. Hydraulic warning. Amelia's breath caught. She froze for a fraction of a second, panic clawing at her. But then instinct took over. She nudged the yoke, adjusted throttle, kept flaps in place, focusing only on the essential. Keep the plane steady, keep the glide slope, survive. The Atlantic roared below, indifferent, but she held course. The runway lights grew larger. Inch by inch the plane descended. Turbulence battered them. Engines hummed under strain. The Atlantic stretched below like a dark mirror, indifferent. But Amelia persisted. Her hands trembled, her jaw set, eyes locked on the horizon. Passengers were silent now, holding their breath, suspended between fear and hope. A sudden, violent gust struck one final time. The plane rocked sharply. Amelia's pulse surged, her stomach lurched. She whispered, hold steady, hold steady. Every micro-adjustment mattered. The plane responded. The runway lights expanded before them. The Atlantic had been crossed. Turbulence had been endured. But the most dangerous moment, landing, was only seconds away. And then, as the runway stretched before her like a fragile lifeline, Amelia Hartley whispered, almost to herself, we're landing this plane, we have to make it. The runway lights stretched before Amelia like fragile threads across the darkness, tiny beacons of life against the endless void of the Atlantic night. Her knuckles were white on the yoke, sweat streaming down her face, vision narrowing to a tunnel focused on the distant tarmac. The plane hummed, wings flexing violently under turbulence, engines straining. Every passenger aboard held their collective breath. The impossible was within reach, but one misstep would turn hope into catastrophe. Amelia adjusted throttle, nudged flaps, and tilted the yoke with trembling precision. The plane responded gradually, imperceptibly inching closer to the runway. London ATC's voice cut through the cockpit, calm but urgent. Flight 742, you're aligned. Begin descent for landing. Glide slope maintained. Flaps fully extended. Watch speed. You're doing incredibly well. Amelia repeated the instructions aloud, translating them into action. The plane dipped slightly, then leveled. Step by step, inch by inch, they approached salvation or disaster. Passengers whispered prayers, some clutching children, some silently weeping. Flight attendants braced themselves, whispering reassurance to passengers even as their own fear throbbed beneath the surface. The young mother held her son tightly, murmuring, we're almost there, stay calm. Amelia's pulse surged at the sight. We cannot fail them now. Not here. Not ever. She adjusted the yoke slightly, compensating for a sudden gust, flaps shaking under the stress. The Atlantic wind roared as the plane dipped lower. The landing gear warning sounded. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. She had never deployed landing gear, never attempted a landing, but instinct and guidance from ATC pushed her forward. Gear down, full extension, confirm, she whispered. A mechanical clunk reverberated through the fuselage and the landing gear locked into place. A wave of adrenaline and fear collided inside her. They were closer, but nothing was certain yet. Turbulence tore through the plane violently, jostling passengers. Tray tables rattled, luggage shifted. The engines groaned under the strain, wings flexing as if resisting the descent. Amelia's stomach lurched, bile threatening, but she forced herself to focus. Every micro-adjustment mattered. Nudging throttle, tilting yoke, adjusting flaps, each action precise, each decision a battle against gravity, wind, and fear. Flight 742, airspeed stable. Maintain glide slope. Begin flare adjustment for landing, ATC instructed. Amelia's hands moved with trembling precision. The plane dipped, then leveled, then dipped again. She whispered aloud, "Airspeed stable, flare adjustment, maintain glide, we can do this." The Atlantic stretched below, endless and unforgiving. The runway ahead shimmered like fragile hope, impossibly far, yet tantalizingly close. Passengers gripped armrests, hearts hammering. Children whimpered. The elderly man whispered a prayer to his wife. Amelia caught their eyes fleetingly. "We are alive together. We must survive together." She adjusted throttle, gently tilted the yoke, coaxed the plane downward. Each vibration, each shudder, each groan of the engines was a test of her resolve. One false move and the Atlantic would claim them all. The runway lights grew larger, brighter, closer. Amelia's pulse raced. The flare, the final maneuver before touching down, loomed ahead. She whispered instructions to herself. Flare, smooth the throttle, gradual touchdown, control. Her hands moved, trembling but precise. The plane responded, descending in small increments, each second an eternity. Then a violent gust struck, lifting the left wing sharply. The plane tilted, passengers screamed. Amelia's stomach lurched, her pulse surging. "Brace, brace," she shouted over the intercom. Tray tables slammed down, luggage shifted. The engines groaned. She gritted her teeth, leaning into the yoke, nudging flaps and throttle to counteract the gust. Slowly, painstakingly, the plane leveled again. The runway remained in sight, inches away but still impossibly distant in her perception. Landing gear trembled as it touched the first uneven currents of air, resisting the descent. Amelia adjusted throttle, nudged the yoke, coaxed the plane downward inch by inch. The Atlantic below remained an endless void, indifferent to courage. Passengers clutched each other, silent, wide-eyed, hearts hammering. Flight attendants whispered reassurances even as their faces were pale with fear. The runway lights stretched closer, the tarmac finally visible beneath the plane. Amelia's hands shook violently. The plane's wheels touched the asphalt unevenly, bouncing slightly under the strain. She forced herself to stay calm, repeating instructions from ATC aloud. "Throttle, gradual, maintain heading, keep steady." The plane groaned, flexed, but obeyed. Inch by inch, the descent continued. Survival felt fragile but real. And then a sudden, violent jolt. One engine sputtered, warning alarms blared. Amelia's stomach lurched. She froze for a split second, heart hammering. "No, not now, please, not now." She adjusted throttle instinctively, nudged the yoke, coaxed the plane back onto the runway path. The engine roared again, responding to her touch. The runway lights stretched beneath them, brighter, closer. The tarmac suddenly reeled beneath their wings. Passengers gasped, some sobbing quietly, some whispering prayers. Flight attendants held their ground, bracing themselves. Amelia's heart raced, sweat stinging her eyes. One miscalculation now, one overcorrection, and everything could unravel. She whispered almost silently, "Steady, steady, steady, flare, touchdown, maintain." The plane descended, inching closer to survival. Then in a moment of surreal terror, the left wing dipped slightly, threatening to veer off course. Amelia's pulse skyrocketed. Her hands moved faster, micro-adjustments translating instinct into action. The plane responded, but barely. The Atlantic's wind currents had one final challenge. The last gust, unpredictable, violent, capable of ending the journey in a heartbeat. The plane struck the runway unevenly, tires screeching against asphalt. The fuselage shuddered violently, bouncing slightly. Passengers screamed, a mix of terror and hope. Amelia leaned into the yoke, nudging, adjusting, coaxing. The plane wobbled, groaned, and then miraculously stabilized. Inch by inch it slowed, engines roaring in protest, flaps resisting, tires gripping the tarmac. "Flight 742, you're stable, runway secured." ATC's voice cracked with relief. Amelia whispered almost inaudibly, "We made it, we're alive." The Atlantic below was still an endless void, but the plane rested on solid ground. The impossible had been achieved. Hundreds of lives survived against all odds. Passengers erupted in quiet sobs, tears streaming, hands clasped together. Children hugged parents tightly, elderly couples wept in relief. Flight attendants exhaled, faces pale but triumphant. Amelia's body shook violently, exhaustion and adrenaline colliding. She leaned back slightly, allowing herself a brief moment of relief, then realized something. The plane had landed, but it was still unstable. Tires screeched, the fuselage shuddered. The final challenge was not over yet. A new alarm blared. Hydraulic pressure warning. One engine still sputtered. Emergency vehicles could be heard in the distance. Amelia's hands tightened on the yoke again. She had landed, but safely stopping the plane, avoiding veering off the tarmac, and ensuring all aboard disembarked safely remained the final test. And as the runway lights stretched before her, red and green signals flickering in the distance, Amelia realized she had survived the impossible. But one final decision could determine if the miracle would truly be complete or end in catastrophe. The plane skidded along the runway, tires screeching, engines groaning in protest. Amelia's hands were white-knuckled on the yoke, knuckles raw, sweat stinging her eyes. Her chest heaved, heart hammering. She had crossed the Atlantic, navigated turbulence, and landed on the runway, but the miracle was not complete. The aircraft shuddered violently, bouncing slightly as hydraulic warnings blared. Panic threatened to rise again, but Amelia forced herself to focus. Every adjustment, every micro-movement, could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. Passengers clutched armrests, eyes wide, breaths held, hearts racing. Flight attendants barked instructions, bracing themselves, guiding passengers to remain calm. The young mother pressed her son close, whispering, "We're almost there, we're safe now." The boy's eyes were wide, reflecting terror and awe. Amelia's pulse surged as she caught their gaze. "We've come this far, we cannot fail now." London ATC's voice crackled, calm but urgent. "Flight 742, reduce speed gradually. Keep straight. Apply brakes carefully. You are doing incredible, maintain focus." Amelia repeated the instructions aloud. "Reduce speed, maintain heading, apply brakes carefully, stay steady." Her hands moved instinctively, nudging throttle and yoke, feathering brakes with trembling precision. The plane groaned, flexing under the strain, but it responded. The tarmac stretched endlessly beneath them, a gray ribbon across the night. Amelia's stomach twisted as the fuselage flexed violently with every uneven patch, but she forced herself to steady the plane. Each second was agony, a test of skill she did not possess, guided only by instinct and ATC's calm voice. She whispered to herself, step by step, inch by inch, "We will survive." Passengers screamed softly as the plane wobbled slightly. A tray table rattled to the floor. Amelia's pulse surged. She nudged the throttle gently, tilted the yoke slightly, coaxed the plane into alignment with the center line. The runway lights shimmered in the distance, red and green signals marking safety and danger. Inch by inch, the aircraft slowed. Miracle by miracle, she moved closer to completing the impossible. A violent jolt sent the fuselage shuddering. Hydraulic alarms blared again. One engine sputtered intermittently. Amelia's stomach lurched. Panic clawed at her, but she swallowed hard, forcing her hands to obey. Steady, steady, throttle, yoke, brakes, keep it straight. The plane flexed, tires squealed, and the tarmac raced beneath them like a blur. Passengers gasped, some whispering prayers, others gripping each other, hearts hammering. The elderly man clasped his wife's hand, whispering a trembling thank you to the unknown hero in the cockpit. The young mother held her child tightly, murmuring, "We're alive thanks to her." Amelia caught the sight, and a surge of determination coursed through her. She could not fail them now. She refused to. London ATC's voice cut through the cockpit again. "Flight 742, you're almost there. Slow speed, keep straight. Minor adjustments only, you're performing a miracle." Amelia repeated aloud, "Slow speed, keep straight, minor adjustments, we can do this." Her fingers moved with trembling precision. The plane's nose dipped slightly, she corrected, nudging the yoke. The engines roared, resisting, but the aircraft obeyed. The tires squealed against the asphalt, sparks flashing faintly beneath the landing gear. Amelia's stomach flipped as the plane bounced slightly. She adjusted throttle, nudged the yoke, pressed brakes carefully. Inch by inch the aircraft decelerated. Passengers gasped, some crying softly, some whispering prayers, some staring in disbelief. The miracle of survival was tangible but fragile. One wrong move could undo everything. A sudden gust rocked the plane violently, throwing it slightly off alignment. Amelia's pulse skyrocketed. She forced herself to steady the yoke, adjust throttle, feather brakes, correct the tilt. The engines groaned. Hydraulic alarms screamed. Sparks flickered faintly beneath the wheels. She could feel every vibration, every tremor, every heartbeat aboard the aircraft. "We are so close, don't fail now." The plane straightened. The fuselage groaned as it flexed under stress. Tires gripped the tarmac. Speed gradually decreased. Passengers leaned back, clutching armrests, whispering, praying, holding breath. Flight attendants called out instructions calmly, though their voices trembled. Amelia's knuckles bled slightly from the yoke, but she pressed on, refusing to let exhaustion or fear dictate action. The Atlantic had been crossed. The miracle was nearly complete. Finally, the plane's forward motion slowed to a crawl. Amelia gently applied brakes, adjusted throttle, nudged the yoke slightly. Inch by inch, the aircraft came to a stop. The engines hummed low. Tires rested firmly on asphalt. The landing gear settled. The fuselage quivered once more, then stilled. Silence descended in the cockpit, followed by the low murmur of disbelief from the passengers. Amelia leaned back, shaking, her body trembling from exhaustion, adrenaline, and relief. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "We made it, we survived." Outside, emergency vehicles roared forward, lights flashing across the runway. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, instructing passengers to remain seated until the plane was fully secured. Then the cabin erupted in tears and soft applause. Children clutched parents tightly, wide-eyed. Elderly passengers wept softly, whispering, "Thank you, God, thank you." The young mother held her child close, sobbing quietly, whispering, "You saved us." Amelia's heart swelled with relief and disbelief. Hundreds of lives had been suspended over the Atlantic, and now every soul aboard was alive. ATC's voice crackled one last time. "Flight 742, you have performed a miracle. Everyone is safe. Incredible job." Amelia's hands fell from the yoke, trembling as she exhaled a long, shaky breath. The impossible had been accomplished. Every adjustment, every trembling instinct, every whispered prayer had culminated in this moment. Survival was no longer a hope, it was reality. Outside, emergency crews swarmed the plane. Passengers began to cautiously unbuckle, stepping into the bright floodlights of the runway. Their faces were pale, tired, and streaked with tears, but alive. The young mother held her son tightly, thanking Amelia through the intercom. The elderly man whispered a prayer of gratitude. Flight attendants guided passengers off the aircraft, their professionalism masking the overwhelming relief and joy flooding their hearts. Amelia remained in the cockpit for a moment, leaning back in her seat, trembling. The plane was still humming softly, engines cooling, fuselage settled. She pressed a hand to her forehead, closing her eyes. Hundreds of lives had depended on her courage, instincts, and composure. She had no formal training, no experience, but she had survived the impossible. She had landed the plane. She had saved them all. Finally, she exhaled, allowing herself a fleeting, fragile smile. The Atlantic was behind them. The runway stretched endlessly ahead, bathed in the glow of emergency lights. Passengers were safe. She had faced fear, chaos, and impossibility, and prevailed. And as Amelia gazed out over the tarmac, hearing the first whispers of gratitude and relief from the passengers, she knew this moment would never leave her. The night hundreds of lives hung in the balance. A woman with no training became a miracle in motion, and the Atlantic had finally yielded.
Ancora le pubblicità. No, ma non sono ancora partite, partiranno tra poco. Spero che non vi partano, ragazzi. Tanto io non ci voglio un cazzo, quindi. Oppure vedetevi Golden Boy e poi capite come l'abito non fa il monaco. Il suo obiettivo finale è imparare cose nuove. Ma l'abito non fa mai il monaco. Bisogna imparare le persone conoscendole, ci vuole tempo. Non conosci una persona in 2 giorni. Ed è il motivo per cui, ad esempio, in chat di Twitch non scrivo subito. Ci metto un po'. E dipendentemente da come. Ok, sono partite le pubblicità. E dipendentemente da come mi si risponde, io capisco. Ci vuole studio, ci vuole tempo. 15-19, siamo verso la fine ormai. Quindi immagino che questo sia il penultimo capitolo e al 19 si apre l'ultimo. Cerchiamo di risolvere questo. Allora, in realtà non sto capendo. Uno, non sto capendo che cosa sia questo coso. Sembra che ci debba andare dentro un laser, ma io non lo vedo. Lì sopra c'è quello che si sblocca. Ah, così? Ah no? Lo fa solo scendere. E quello lì come si toglie? Ho come... Ma ho come l'impressione che ci vorrebbe il flusso che c'era prima, eppure non ce l'ho. Non è che è nascosto da qualche parte? Là c'è una scala. Guarda che mi guarda sto bastardo. Fatti gli affari tuoi. Questo butta giù.